You're listening to the Mad Fictional Imagination Playhouse audio presentation of Happy Valley Reapers by Ryan Scorpio Reese.
Chapter 2. Whispers in the Dark. For a moment no one spoke. What was that sound? Squirt's voice broke the silence, trembling and almost inaudible. His wide eyes darted to the edges of the room, where the shadows seemed to curl and shift, taking on shapes that felt just a little too solid. Trigby forced a scoff, though his jaw clenched as he did. It's nothing. Houses like this make noises. Probably an old pipe or, I don't know, a draft. He didn't believe it, but the words came anyway, reflexive and hollow. The heavy oak door groaned shut behind them, the metallic click of the latch sealing them in with an unsettling finality. The room, moments ago alive with the flickering warmth of the fire, now seemed to grow darker, as though the very walls absorbed the light. Dust motes hovered like tiny phantoms in the thin shafts of moonlight that pierced the arched windows. Juju let her fingers brush the edge of a nearby table, the surface smooth and cold beneath her touch. "This place is wrong," she muttered, her voice low but carrying weight. Her hand twitched toward the stun gun at her belt, a habit she'd picked up whenever her instincts screamed danger. The group moved forward, reluctant feet scuffing against the polished wooden floors. The long hallway stretched endlessly ahead of them, its faintly gleaming boards disappearing into a void of shadows. The walls were lined with portraits, their gilded frames tarnished with age. The faces within were rendered in exquisite detail, each painted expression eerily lifelike. As the teens passed, it felt as though the figures in the paintings tracked their progress, their unblinking eyes following every movement. "Why is it so quiet?" Punky whispered. Her voice sounded muffled, as if the very air were conspiring to swallow the sound. Moz glanced over his shoulder, his silhouette broad and solid against the dim light. "This place is huge. They're probably in another wing or something," he growled. His tone was sharp, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The air thickened as they ventured deeper, carrying a scent that gnawed at the edges of their senses. It was sweet, sickly sweet like rotting flowers, and tinged with an undercurrent of something metallic. Somewhere in the distance, a grandfather clock struck. Its chime rang out 13 times, the sound heavy and deliberate, vibrating through the floor beneath their feet. On the 13th strike, the clock stopped, its tick silenced mid-beat. Juju froze, her head tilting sharply to one side. "I know I'm not the only one who heard that." The others stopped, straining their ears. A faint whisper slithered through the corridor, brushing past them like a cold breath. It wasn't the wind. It was something deliberate. The sound carried no words, only an unsettling cadence, as though it were trying to say something they couldn't understand. "Keep moving," Moz said, his voice lower now, the edge of his bravado wearing thin. They reached the grand staircase, its curved banister and intricately carved spindles gleaming faintly in the dim light. The stone steps were uneven, their edges worn down by centuries of use. Punky hesitated, her gaze lingering on the darkness pooling at the base of the stairs. "Come on," Trigby snapped. He was ahead of her, already testing the first step. The wood groaned beneath his weight, a long, low creak that set their nerves on edge. The descent was slow, each step a test of courage. The air grew colder as they went, the chill seeping into their clothes and biting at their exposed skin. Shadows seemed to stretch and ripple, reaching toward them with fingers of darkness. "The house is definitely watching us," Squirt whispered, his voice quivering. Trigby shot him a sharp look but didn't respond. They all felt it, that sense of being observed, scrutinized by something unseen. Finally, they reached the turret door. It loomed before them, a hulking slab of wood reinforced with bands of iron. Moz placed a hand on the handle, his fingers curling around it tightly. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then pushed it open. The wind rushed in immediately, howling up the spiral staircase and carrying with it a sound that was almost, but not quite, a voice. Moz led the way, his broad shoulders hunched against the relentless gusts. The stairs were narrow, the stones slick with condensation and crumbling at the edges. Each step was a gamble, the faint give of the old stone under their boots a constant reminder of how precarious their climb was. Juju followed close behind, her grappling hook slung across her back. She muttered under her breath, cursing the treacherous steps as her fingers gripped the rough wall for balance. "Don't look down," Trigby said to no one in particular. Punky made the mistake of glancing over the edge, her stomach flipping violently as she caught a glimpse of the dizzying drop below. She pressed herself against the wall, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Keep going," Moz barked, his voice cutting through the wind. At last, they emerged onto the roof. The night sky stretched out above them, vast and oppressive, the stars faint and distant. The wind tore at their clothes, howling like a living thing. Moz wasted no time, approaching the weather vane with determined strides. He gripped the corroded metal and twisted, his muscles straining against the resistance. The vane groaned in protest, refusing to budge. "Hurry up!" Juju shouted over the wind, her hands gripping the railing to steady herself. With a final wrenching twist, Moz freed the vane. He tossed it aside, the old rooster clattering against the stone. Punky handed him the new one, her hands trembling. As Moz secured it, the wind shifted. It carried a sound with it now, a scream long and piercing, echoing through the night. It was inhuman, a terrible sound that clawed at their nerves. Moz tightened the last bolt and turned to the others. His jaw was set, his eyes dark with unspoken fear. When Moz stuffed the Vesperwaite weather vane in his backpack and climbed back down, Squirt's voice broke the silence. "Guys, look!" They followed his gaze to a section of the wall just beneath the balcony. There, etched into the stone, was a symbol. It was intricate and strange, a series of interlocking lines and spirals that seemed to pulse faintly in the moonlight. "What the hell is that?" Juju whispered, her voice barely audible. Trigby crouched to get a closer look, his breath visible in the frigid air. "It's just graffiti," he said, though his voice wavered. "That's not graffiti," Punky said, stepping back. "I've seen that symbol before. It's on the old train station, and on that burned-out church on Larchwood." "It's everywhere," Squirt added. His voice was eerily calm, his eyes fixed on the symbol. "I think it's a warning." Before anyone could respond, another scream tore through the night. It wasn't human, at least, not entirely. It was high-pitched and guttural, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The group froze, their breaths caught in their throats. "We need to leave," Moz said, his voice low and urgent. "No argument here," Juju replied, already moving toward the stairs. As they began their descent, the wind seemed to shift, carrying with it a sound that chilled them to their core, a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant. Chapter 3. Ethan's Shadow. The scream sliced through the night again as the Reapers began their frantic descent from the turret. Their earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing dread that made every sound feel sharper, every shadow seem alive. The rubber chicken, so comical and absurd in their hands, now felt like a cruel joke. "Move!" Moz barked, his voice low but commanding as he helped the others navigate the slick, ivy-covered walls. "That wasn't the mansion settling," Punky hissed, struggling to keep her footing. Her usual bravado was absent, her voice thin and brittle. "That was a scream." "Less talking, more climbing," Juju snapped, her grappling hook rattling against the stone as she descended. Trigby's foot slipped on a loose piece of masonry, sending a spray of dust and pebbles clattering to the ground below. He froze, heart hammering as he clung to the wall, the wind cold against his damp palms. What if it's still out there?" he whispered. Squirt was already on the ground, looking smaller than usual in the shadows. "Whatever it is," he called softly, "we're better off figuring it out when we're far away from this place. Get down here." When the last of them dropped to the ground, they exchanged glances, their faces pale in the moonlight. Without a word, they sprinted toward the town square, their breaths visible in the cold air, their sneakers slapping against the cobblestones. The square was eerily still. The streetlights, normally warm and inviting, flickered weakly, casting strange patterns across the ground. The fountain in the centre, which usually burbled cheerfully, was silent, its basin dark and dry. Long shadows stretched across the square, twisting and writhing like living things. "What the hell happened here?" Moz muttered, his eyes scanning the empty space. "It's too quiet," Juju said, her voice a bare whisper. "Look." Squirt's voice trembled as he pointed toward the fountain. In the faint moonlight, a single piece of paper fluttered weakly against the cobblestones. Punky approached cautiously, her heart pounding as she crouched to pick it up. "It's one of those missing posters," she said, holding it out for the others to see. The edges were weathered, the ink smudged, but the face was unmistakable. "Ethan," Squirt said, his voice breaking. He stared at the image of the shy, quiet boy they had defended so many times before. "He's missing." The string of disappearances had been the talk of Happy Valley for weeks. People whispered about troubled homes and runaway children, quick to blame bad parenting. To most, Ethan would be just another tragic footnote in the town's questionable history. The Reapers exchanged uneasy glances. Something about his disappearance just didn't sit right. "We just saw him today," Trigby said, his voice tinged with guilt. "By the creek. He was—" "Getting picked on," Moz finished, his tone grim. "Like always." "We chased those jerks off," Punky said quickly as if trying to absolve herself. "We did what we always do." "But did you see him?" Squirt asked. His eyes were wide and glassy, brimming with a raw, aching fear. "Did you see how different he was? Like he didn't even care they were picking on him anymore?" The memory hit them all at once. Ethan standing there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow. He hadn't thanked them like he usually did. He hadn't even looked at them. He had just stood there, staring into the distance as if he were already gone. "We should have done more," Squirt whispered, his voice cracking. "We should have stayed with him." "And said what?" Moz snapped, though his anger was clearly directed at himself. "We can't fix everything, Squirt." "We tried." Juju knelt to examine the flyer, running her fingers over its faded surface. "This wasn't here earlier," she said, frowning. "It's like someone wanted us to find it." "What are you talking about?" Trigby asked. "Someone like who?" Before Juju could respond, the wind picked up again, carrying with it a faint sound that froze them in place. It wasn't another scream, but something worse, a low, mournful wail, barely audible but unmistakably human. "There it is again," Punky said, her voice shaking. "Where's it coming from?" Trigby asked, spinning in a slow circle. Squirt's gaze snapped to the edge of the square, where the shadows seemed to pool unnaturally, thick and impenetrable. "There," he said, pointing. "No," Juju said, grabbing his arm. "We're not going in there. Not without a plan." Squirt shook her off. "Ethan might be in there. We can't just leave him." Moz stepped between them, his imposing frame casting a long shadow. "We're not splitting up," he said firmly. "In horror movies, that's how people get killed. If we're going together." The group hesitated, their fear palpable. The square, once a familiar safe space, now felt like a predator lying in wait. The wail came again, louder this time, and Squirt took an involuntary step forward. "This isn't a game anymore," Trigby said, his voice low. "Whatever's happening here, it's not normal. But if something is happening to Ethan and we can stop it but don't, then what's the point of us?" The Reapers nodded, though the fear in their eyes remained. The missing poster fluttered in the wind, its corners curling as if trying to escape. As they stepped toward the edge of the square, the darkness seemed to deepen, swallowing their shadows whole. The air grew colder, heavier, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of fear. They weren't just searching for Ethan now. They were unraveling something much bigger, something ancient, something wrong. And as they crossed into the waiting shadows, they knew there was no turning back. Chapter 4. The sheriff's cold shoulder. The shadows at the edge of the deserted square stretched like long, crooked fingers reaching for the reapers. The air clung to their skin, damp and suffocating, as if warning them to turn back. Each step felt deliberate, heavier than the last, driven by a mix of fear and unshakable urgency. "Keep your eyes peeled," Moz whispered, gripping the rusty hook in his hand. They moved together, a tight, silent formation. Ahead, the faint wail they'd followed morphed into something more distinct, a choked cry, raw and desperate. They turned the corner and Squirt, walking slightly ahead, stopped so abruptly that Juju almost collided with him. "What is it?" Juju hissed, but Squirt didn't answer. His hand trembled as he reached for a scrap of fabric caught on the jagged edge of a chain-link fence. The material was damp and torn, darkened in places by something that looked suspiciously like blood. "It's Ethan's hoodie," Squirt murmured. His voice cracked, and the sight of the familiar garment sent a shiver through the group. Ethan wore that hoodie every day, its oversized hood practically swallowing him. Before anyone could speak, a harsh beam of light sliced through the darkness, blinding them. "Freeze!" The command came from a gruff, unmistakable voice. They turned as one to see Sheriff Brody, his bulk illuminated by his flashlight's harsh glow. His silhouette loomed larger than life, a solid wall of authority wrapped in a rumpled uniform. "What are you kids doing out here?" Brody barked, his flashlight moving from face to face, each pale and wide-eyed. "We're looking for Ethan," Juju managed, holding up the scrap of fabric. The sheriff's flashlight dropped to the hoodie fragment, which he snatched from her hand. He examined it, his heavy brow furrowing as his thick fingers turned it over. "And you found this where?" "By the fence," Moz said, pointing back toward the dark alleyway. Brody's expression hardened. "That's what I thought. Tampering with evidence. You're lucky I don't haul you all in right now." Punky bristled, stepping forward. "We're trying to help. Something's wrong, and you're just standing around doing nothing." "Enough!" Brody interrupted sharply, his voice echoing off the empty buildings. He lowered the flashlight, his glare cutting through the tension like a blade. "You kids don't know what you're messing with. Go home. Now before you make things worse." "But we found—" "Home!" Brody snapped, his hand hovering over the radio clipped to his belt. "Don't make me call your parents." "And tell them what?" Punky shot back, defiant. "That I caught you skulking away from the Vesperwaite place with a hook and rope and a suspicious backpack," Brody replied, his eyes narrowing. "Criminal trespass and burglary sound like charges you want to explain to your folks, because I've got paperwork to file, and I'd be happy to add your names to the pile." The reapers exchanged uneasy glances. Moz shifted the weight of the lumpy backpack containing the Vesperwaite weather vane on his shoulder, and Juju instinctively crossed her arms over her chest, shielding the coiled rope slung across her back. "Look!" Trigby said, his voice surprisingly steady. He took a cautious step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "We know it sounds bad, but we're not just wandering around. Ethan's our friend. We were with him earlier today, and he wasn't okay." The sheriff's frown deepened, but he said nothing. "We think something happened to him," Trigby pressed. "Something bad." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint rustle of wind through the empty square. "Kids get into trouble," Brody said finally, his tone gruff and dismissive. "Runaways, stupid stunts, whatever it is, it's not your problem, it's mine." He stuffed the fabric scrap into his pocket, a move that felt like erasure. "Now, get out of here before I really lose my patience." "You're not even looking for him, are you?" Punky challenged, her voice quaking with barely restrained anger. "You've already decided he's a runaway, so you can sit on your fat." Moz grabbed her arm, cutting her off before she said something she couldn't take back. "Come on," he muttered, his voice low. "Let's go." They hesitated, each of them itching to argue, but Moz's quiet insistence was enough to break their resolve. One by one they turned and walked away, their shoulders hunched against the weight of defeat. Behind them Brody watched, his expression unreadable. As the reapers disappeared into the shadows, he muttered something under his breath and pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Brody," he said, his voice low. "Send a patrol to the square. I've got a bad feeling about tonight." The Reapers didn't speak until they were well away from the square, the sheriff's glare still burning in their minds. "We're on our own," Juju said finally, her voice heavy with frustration. "We always were," Moz replied grimly. For the first time, they felt the full weight of what they were up against. Not just the unknown force behind Ethan's disappearance, but the indifference of those who were supposed to protect them. And as the cold night deepened around them, the Reapers made a silent, unspoken vow. Whatever it took, they would find Ethan.
You've been listening to the Mad Fictional Imagination Playhouse audio presentation of Happy Valley Reapers by Ryan Scorpio Reese. If you've enjoyed yourself, consider hitting like and subscribe, and ring the notification bell to be alerted to new video and audio content when they drop. Also, if you would be so kind as to leave us a comment, we would greatly appreciate it. We need to let the algorithm know that this channel exists. Thanks for listening. Ciao, till next now.